Hello. Tough crowd. It's good to see you. I'm Steve Lee. I lead something called Miracle Street. Been doing that for nearly 40 years. I'm also part of the staff team of Hope Church Winchester, but I live in Southampton. I've committed a sort of a clothing malfunction this morning. It was 96 degrees on the North Island when I left, but it's freezing over here, isn't it? What's going on? But it's really great to be with you today. Last November, at the end of November, I was 60. I know, remarkable. I look great, don't I? I really do look good on that. Okay. And I felt the Lord started to speak to me last summer about a major kind of shift in what I've been doing in, as I say, since I met Andy and Ange and Si and Nick and a few others decades ago. Danny Neal as well, back in the day. Nice to see you, Danny. So really I've been involved in leading people to Christ on the margins. I feel that God called me in many ways beyond the congregation. I love the church. I've always been very committed to church, part of it. I've spent my life working with churches and particularly working with leaders in helping people to recalibrate church to meet the fast-changing culture that we are a part of. I love the church, but I feel God called me to the world. And when I first became a Christian, I genuinely believed that I was going to be God's special helper. I was reading a lot about Billy Graham. For those of you who are new to the church and a bit new to this whole Jesus thing, congratulations, you've survived the first 45 minutes. Billy Graham, who's now in heaven, was a very prolific American evangelist who filled football stadiums and vast venues around the world throughout a glittering, spectacular career as one of God's combined harvesters. And I really felt that I was, going to be into all that stuff as well. And then I had a dream. And I felt in that dream that God took me to this field. And I knew it was in a rough area, kind of where I grew up, sort of kind of place, in the back end of Worthing in West Sussex. Unlike Angela Stubbings, who grew up in a posher part of Worthing, I was at the rough end. Remember that, Ange? And I remembered this in this dream. I recognized this place. It wasn't a place that I'd actually been to, but I recognized the type of place it was. It was in the middle of a kind of a council estate, and there were broken bikes and sort of dog poo and just wreckage everywhere. And then suddenly I saw all these kids just arriving. And I felt, and I was looking at this dream. It was one of these moments where I thought, what is this? What's the context to it? And I felt God speak to me, and it was something that has defined my life. And what I felt God say to me was this: will you reach people in a place like this, or will you only do it in football stadiums? And it broke my heart. But I realized that what was going on is that God was dismantling my vanity and my sense of ambition, and I was better off without it. But that really has shaped my journey. I've reached many families and kids and people from all kinds of different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, in some of the toughest, most volatile council estates in the UK. It's been an absolute privilege and an honor. And last summer, as I approached my 60th, I felt God speak to me. And all my life, I've said that I will never end up speaking in churches and conferences about what I used to do. I will spend my life on the coalface of mission. And I felt last summer that God said to me, go back and pick up what you left behind. And I realized that the one thing that I said I would never do, I was in danger of doing. Ending up becoming a specialist, working with churches and leaders and strategy and all this kind of stuff. And I felt God say to me, go back to the coalface, back to where you started from. And in this last year, I probably have seen more people come to Christ than I have in the previous 10. Now, that's nothing to do with me. It's nothing that I feel you should be impressed with. It's simply about me, and I would challenge each of us that we've got to be obedient to the voice of God in these dangerous, volatile days in which we live. I really sign up to this whole thing, the quiet revival. Have you heard about this? For me, what that suggests is something that God is doing beyond the platform, even beyond the congregation, but at the margins of society with the discarded and the unwanted. They are the people, as we have spent our lives, some of us, in the context of our programs and our tidy meetings, God's eyes are always on the poor, always on the broken, and always on the forgotten. I believe now more than at any time in my life that this gospel of the kingdom is the answer to the human struggle. It's the only answer. It's the only thing that is going to make any sense of the madness that we are living in right now. My journey has been very much communicating on the street, and as I say, in very secular environments. I felt that God called me as an evangelist here on the island in Knighton. Many years ago, I came over because I knew Angela and a few others, and I met Andy and Si and Nick and others at that time. And I encountered the Holy Spirit here on the island for the first time in that sense. And that's why I love coming back to this island. I only live in Southampton, but I love coming back here. And for me, I learnt how to communicate, really, I would say, from the stage, not from the pulpit. I knew God had called me as an evangelist, and I knew He called me to the street, and then I discovered what a street evangelist was, and I thought, I don't want to be one of them weirdos. One of those people that just sort of, shout obscure verses from the minor prophets to the public and scare the children. I thought I've got to be a bit more engaging than that. So I learned how to be a street entertainer. And I sat on the wall at Covent Garden for hours and hours, and I learned how to communicate. And that took me to all kinds of situations, doing kids entertainment professionally. I did magic shows in Butlins and did bizarre stuff in student bars and cut people's heads off. Done it out on the street here, all that kind of normal Christian stuff. And really, it was because I had a passion to be relevant and current, to be a storyteller. I'm a natural storyteller, and I really feel that there was something in that God showed me and taught me all those years ago that has been with me all of my life. Before I dive into what I really want to talk about now, and I'm going to be quite brief, I want to say this to you. Very few of the Jesus encounters happened in religious contexts. Have you ever noticed that? Very, very few happened in religious or spiritual contexts. Always, almost without exception, in the secular environments. Mostly on the street, in a house, someone's house, on a lake, in a boat, or in this case, up a mountain. And we're going to dive into this story for a few minutes today. It is a little bit worrying how many religious hoops people are asked to jump through in order to encounter the gospel. Quite worrying. There's a great story that is doing the rounds on Instagram at the moment, and I've seen it a number of times over the years, but essentially this is it. So as most of you know, those of you who are not used to church, let me just tell you that Jesus was crucified on a Roman cross alongside two thieves. He was in the middle, right? And he had a conversation with one of those guys on the cross who knew that what he had done was wrong. He knew he was being punished legitimately for what he had done, but he knew that Jesus was innocent. And he said to Jesus, "Remember me." And Jesus said, "Today you will be with me in paradise or in heaven." And the story goes like this, that this guy that Jesus spoke to ends up at the gates of heaven. And St. Peter's there with a clipboard, checking everyone in, asking them a few questions. And he says to him, "What church are you from?" And he goes, "I don't know what you're talking about. I've never been to church." And he goes, "Oh, interesting, bit challenging." He said, "So what do you understand about the doctrine of salvation?" "Never heard of it." And there's all these questions, and it's just like, And at the end, Peter says to him, So what are you doing here, and how did you get here? And this is his response. The guy on the middle cross said I could come. You see, it is disturbing how many unspoken qualifications we put upon this thing that we call the good news. And unfortunately, if we have got good news being spoken about by people who are essentially bad news, we're going to have a problem, because people judge books by covers, I'm afraid. So Jesus never came to start a religion. He came to end religion and replace it with relationships, something far better. So let's zero in on the only miracle of Jesus that appears in all four of the Gospels. So it's probably pretty important. Well, there is another one, actually, the resurrection of Jesus. That's in all four for fairly good reasons, although parts of the church wish it wasn't. So we're going to look at this amazing event right now. I'm using the Message, or the Mills and Boon Bible, as some people call it, just to give the context. I think the Message is very, very good with this particular story, so should appear up on the screen. Let's read it. This is from John 6. When Jesus looked out and saw that a large crowd had arrived, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy bread to feed these people?" He said this to stretch Philip's faith. He already knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 200 silver pieces wouldn't be enough to buy bread for each person to get a piece. One of the disciples, it was Andrew, brother to Simon Peter, said, "There's a little boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But that's a drop in the bucket for a crowd like this." Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was a nice carpet of green grass in this place. They sat down, about 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took the bread and, having given thanks, gave it to those who were seated. He did the same with the fish. All ate as much as they wanted. When the people had eaten their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the leftovers, let nothing be wasted." So they went to work and filled 12 large baskets with leftovers from the 5 barley loaves. The people realized that God was at work among them. I reckon they did. In what Jesus had done, they said, "This is the prophet for sure, God's prophet right here in Galilee." There's a lot going on in this story, and we're just going to take a few minutes to dig into it, including the elephant in the room, which is essentially that of all of these people that had followed Jesus up a mountain, only this kid had remembered to bring his lunch with him. Ever thought about that? 5,000 people, but they only counted the blokes, because as we know, it was a highly misogynist system that Jesus came into. That's why what he did in elevating women was so powerful and so groundbreaking. So there might have been 9, 10, 11, 12,000 people. Who knows, with women and children, but an awful lot of people. So there's a great deal going on here as Jesus feeds these people with small pieces of bread and fish, like some kind of giant tapas festival. Nothing there for the vegans or the gluten-free. Maybe they had to bring their own stuff. It's a little bit like the reference to the lamb flowing with milk and honey in the Old Testament. You know, not much there in terms of a keto diet or those who needed other versions of non-dairy milk. But this is an extremely public and very dramatic moment where it appears that heaven touches earth and everyone in the region gets to be a part of it. So the disciples have watched this vast crowd follow Jesus into this wide open space. And it would appear from the story that they are freaking out somewhat, you know, because they're kind of saying, you know, what are we going to do with this? You know, all these people are coming up. We're not quite used to this sort of mass crowds. I mean, there were other moments, as we know, when Jesus was surrounded by crowds, but they're in this wide open space, and suddenly into that moment, not very religious, not a clerical environment or a church environment, to use our sort of terms of reference. They're in this wide open space, and suddenly into that moment, into the context of this story, the miraculous ministry of Jesus detonates in that moment, and something impossible takes place. But there is a whole lot more going on in this particular event than the all-you-can-eat buffet lunch. Okay, there's a lot more going on. So let's try and travel back for a few minutes. Back 2,000 years, approximately 2,000 miles from where we are today, and step inside this story. And as we do it, let's allow it to recalibrate our assumptions, the things that we hold on to that unfortunately are not always in the Bible. It's just what we like to do. It's the stuff we've inherited. A lot of what we do on a Sunday morning, we need to be careful not to make biblical absolutes about. It's just what we do. It doesn't make it wrong or bad or evil. We've just got to hold it lightly. Other people will do this differently to us. As we know, we're living in a fast-moving, ever-changing culture. That's just this culture, let alone the beautiful cultures across the earth. Talking into this culture, we are seeing generations of young people and children being raised in this generation who do not read by choice. And if we continue to communicate a message that is only in a book, we will fail. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we don't need the Bible. We desperately need the Bible. But we need to be careful that we don't turn church into a university or a lecture theatre. We have lost the art of discipleship, and we've replaced discipleship with teaching. Teaching is important, but we've got to mentor people. We've got to allow people to be apprentices in the spiritual formation of what is required. So let's step into this story. I love to do this with the Bible. As I say, I'm more of a storyteller than a teacher in that sense. I'm used to communicating to people who don't line up with what I believe. In some ways, speaking in church is sometimes a little bit disorientating because people are quite polite. And, I'm used to being resisted, argued with, heckled. When I started out, people used to throw fruit at me, still in the cans. So, I do think we've got to realize that we are not always going to be agreed with. So let's kind of get into this thing and try and see it through the eyes of people who don't quite get this whole Jesus thing and see what's going on. Sometimes the church can look a little bit strange to outsiders. I often tell people that you don't need to be odd to be a Christian, but it really helps. No one who listened to Jesus or saw his miracles had to change who they were or somehow adjust their culture in order to be part of what he was doing. In fact, the opposite is true. We often find Jesus adjusting his approach and his demeanor to be accessible to all kinds of people with all kinds of different backgrounds. It does worry me, as I've said, that people seem to be so deeply connected to Jesus, even though he was challenging and sometimes deeply offensive. It was always the people who were on the margins who loved to be around Jesus, the young, the dying, the sick, the rejected, and the unwanted. And sometimes people's reaction to church is not the same as that. And so I think we've got to be very honest about it. Jesus was super successful in impacting communities, but because he paid careful attention to culture, even to history, and to the context every time he spoke or acted. Karl Barth said, preach the gospel with a newspaper in one hand and a Bible in the other. I think that is very, very important. Increasingly, I believe that we have to recognize that a great deal of what we have held on to, we have got to let go of in order to be more effective. So let's dive into this passage that we've read. I want to say that there are huge cultural connections here. Jesus was this fabulous three-dimensional storyteller who always knew his audience. He'd always done his homework. That's why the people loved him. That's why they chased him up a mountain to be part of his scene and to be part of what he was about. If Jesus was this first century religious weirdo, why were they there? Why were they there? Why were the kids there? Why were the people who needed to know that they were loved the most? Why were those people around Jesus if he was patronizing, odd, weird, and strange? The only thing you can deduce from this is that he wasn't. It's a very interesting illustration to that, the statement that I've just made, is that when you remember when Jesus is arrested, he's betrayed by Judas. I don't know how he ever made it through the selection panel, but he did. He's stitched up by Judas, but then they are on the Mount of Olives, and the soldiers come with Judas, and Judas says, "The one that I kiss on the cheek, that's your man." Now, if Jesus was an odd religious first century hippie who stood out from the crowd, why did he have to be identified? He had to be identified. Why? Because he looked the same as everybody else. He fitted in, he blended with his environment. So Jesus knew what it was to connect with his culture, and we must know what it is to connect with ours. So this whole thing that he's doing on the mountainside, it's been presented in a way to have maximum impact to the people that he was trying to reach. God is always on the move, as we know, and he is always doing something new. And the Bible says that, "Behold, I do a new thing." But usually, everything that he does has echoes of the past. Have you noticed that? So it's sort of new, but it's ancient at the same time. It's relevant and current, but it kind of feels like this is what he's always done. It's a wonderful balance and almost like a paradox in the way that God moves. So God is on the move, he's doing a new thing, but it often has echoes of the past. And as Jesus breaks this bread and feeds these people with bread and fish, 1,500 years earlier, Moses had led the people of Israel into the wilderness where God provided them with bread that seemed to come out of nowhere. So let's look at what's going on here. Mark and Matthew both refer to this mountain as a remote place. Once again, a Jewish crowd are being given free bread from heaven. Jesus knows exactly what he is doing. So he takes the bread, and in different translations it's explained in different ways, but he breaks the bread, he holds it up, he blesses it, and then it is multiplied without limit. And as that happens, I believe the connection is made with this crowd. And they're starting to look at this whole situation. And these people are thinking, here's someone who understands us. He knows our history. He knows our culture. He knows our book. He knows everything about us. But there is a power in this to unlock frozen situations. The miracle on the mountain was not just about the provision of food. It was about the acknowledgement that heaven and earth have collided. And now anything is possible because Jesus is here. When Jesus is in the middle of something, impossible situations become possible. Things happen when Jesus is in the room. But so often we have spent our lives devoted to our programs, devoted to our ideas, and we've asked God to bless them. There's nothing inherently bad about that, but do you know what? A far better way to live, and I'm learning this at the age of 60, a far better way to live is to discover and to discern what God is already doing and ask him in his grace to include us in on it. That's a better way to live. I spent my life being trained in Pioneer. I was part of Gerald Coates' thing as I was growing up. And one of the things that he said, and many things that he said that I remember, but one of the things he said that stuck in my mind was this: God is always doing 10 times more behind your back than he is ever doing in front of your face. So true. So we've got to learn how to say to God, in your grace, would you include me in? Would you include my church, my congregation, my family, my people in on what you are doing? And then I think we will be amazed by what he can do. So let's talk about compassion then. The compassion of Jesus for this vast crowd is massive. It is absolutely huge. but he also uses this encounter to work something into the hearts of his disciples as well. So he is meeting the need, he's communicating the kingdom of heaven, but he's mentoring these kind of wannabes who very soon are going to have the baton in their hands and they're going to be leading this thing. That's frightening when you look at the kind of misfits that Jesus selected. Just imagine, he had the pick of every up-and-coming rabbinic student in the whole of that part of the world. And who did he pick? Judas, Peter, Thomas. You see that remarkable situation at the, after Jesus has died and been raised again, and of course it's all gone wrong, the wheels are off. Peter's, committed a series of unbelievable public indiscretions, failing to even acknowledge that he knows Jesus, let alone that he's the one that Jesus said in the valley at Caesarea Philippi, you are the one, and on the rock, the substance of what you have just said, when he said you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus going, Peter, it's not you, but what you've just said, that revelation, this whole thing's going to go up. And then you see what goes wrong. And you're thinking, bad choice, Jesus. Judas, well, enough said about him, the better. And Thomas, well, Thomas is having a crisis of faith, isn't he? After these resurrection appearances, Thomas is going, not quite sure. But I tell you what, if I could put my finger in the holes in his hand, then I believe. And I think if I'd have been one of the disciples, I would have been thinking, come on, Tom, mate. You've done the program, fella. You're 3 years in. You really should be a little bit more advanced in this whole faith thing. So this is the motley crew that Jesus, on this mountainside, he's trying to work something into his disciples as well, about the supernatural and the miraculous and how it works and how compassion and power have got to be side by side in everything that we do. Hello? Compassion and power. It's no good us just having power, and it's no good us just having compassion. We've got to recognize we're not social services. We're not here to be the welfare state. We are here to love the lonely, to feed the hungry, to give life to the broken, but we must never hide the gospel, ever. I'm working right now with Southampton City Council. They're signing off on a whole load of stuff that we're doing. But I have never been a place before where I have not needed to hide the gospel like I don't need to hide it anymore. Someone said to me quite recently, so what is Miracle Street and what are your intentions? If I had a quid for every time I've been asked that question in the last 35 years, I'd have a pension pot, which I haven't got. And I said, you know what? I said, we are in the spirit and the tradition of the 19th century Christian reformers like Wilberforce and Shaftesbury and William Booth, who saw the chronic need in society, but realized that only a message of personal transformation is going to solve the problem. And that's why they engaged with the hideous evils of slavery, and they fronted the abolition movement. They dealt with the problems of prison reform and education and the abandonment of widows and orphans, and the church followed. And then in 1947, the welfare state comes along, social services, now the NHS, and two things happened. Central government stepped in and took over the whole of that thing, and guess what? The church switched off. But now, all that system's fallen over, and the church is coming back. Church is re-engaging, not just with social projects, not just to meet the need, because as Jesus said, the poor will always be with you. It's not about meeting the needs. It's about being Christ-centered. It's about being Spirit-led. And it's about recognizing that only the gospel, not food banks, not opening schools, all of those things are fine in themselves. But the gospel, front and center, like never before. I'm miles off my notes. So going back into this story, Jesus is educating his disciples at the same time as he is meeting a need, but the need is all about the provision of heaven onto the earth. So 30 verses later, Jesus is describing himself as the bread of life. Now, if I'd have been in the crowd when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, I would have thought, right, so is that the bread or are you the bread? What's the bread? Where's the bread? Who's the bread? Because I'm a little bit thick, I'm sorry about that. I had a few sort of educational challenges when I was about 10 or 12. I saw sort of specialists to help me read. I'm not very bright. And I didn't have dyslexia. I thought I did, but I did get diagnosed. And someone really helped me to understand that I'm just a bit stupid. So it's nice to get the clarity. But what Jesus is doing in saying he's the bread of life is that he is digging deep into the age-old problem that is still massively prevalent in our society today, which essentially is the presence of this crater within the human soul that can never be filled with anything other than God himself. That craving that is constantly presenting itself throughout society. We cannot simply live by filling the physical space. We need something else. Everybody knows that's true. Christian or not, everybody knows that's true. Everybody knows that the suicide rate is as high in the rich as it is in the poor. Everybody knows that the world does not have the answer to the deep human questions. But what happens? We spend our lives giving ourselves to things that do not bring people happiness in some crazy, worthless pursuit of filling that aching void on the inside. It's the problem that is so deep within our society, and it's the reason why people search for the answer. And they search for it in a chemically induced high, a relational encounter, or a shopping trip. It's all the same. It's an attempt to fill this deep, aching need within the human heart. So what Jesus did, and this is why I talked a little bit about things like food banks, and I don't want to speak against any of that. Jesus is dealing with the physical need, but the context is coming. The context is, I am the bread of life. You don't just need that bread, you need this bread. It's the same as what he said to the woman at the well, the story of water, living water. This woman has to keep going back to the well. She says, I have to keep going back, the bucket's okay, the wells are, keep coming back and back and back. And Jesus talks about living water. He talks about an artesian well that is installed on the inside of the human soul. And if you've got that going on, you will never be thirsty again. Same analogy with bread. Jesus is constantly marrying together the physical need of humanity and the aching spiritual void which underpins and overarches all of our needs. So he's challenging the crowd, but he's challenging his followers as well. But there's also some problems of a logistical nature, I would suggest, with this story. I love it when it says, get the people to sit down. Jesus says, get the people to sit down because there was plenty of grass. Yeah, sure, give me a break. As if that's the problem, space. 10,000 people possibly. The problem is not grass and space. The problem, I would suggest, is the total absence of a zoning system. High-vis workwear, megaphones, short-circuit radio, risk assessments, safeguarding procedures, none of that seems to be in place. I've spent my life in outdoor events, some of them very large, and quite often I've signed off the risk assessment. And I'll tell you what, I read stories like this, and one of my biggest questions, sorry, this is very unspiritual. One of my biggest questions is, how on earth did that work? Now, 5,000 men. Now, we all know what men are like when they're hungry. Sometimes irrational, sometimes worse, sometimes aggressive. So these hungry blokes, along with their families, have made their way up this mountain. And apparently, the only problem that needs to be solved is space. Very interesting. I think what we can deduce from this is that Jesus did not align himself with the system. He didn't enforce the status quo. He was doing something different. And there seemed to be some order that was right in the middle of this thing. Why? Because Jesus was in the heart of it. That's when we see order. That doesn't mean to say that we are neglectful around policies and procedure, particularly safeguarding. We need to be on all of those things. Why? Because we are not of the world, but we are in the world. And sometimes we forget that. We remember we're not of the world when we're in times of ecstatic worship, and we can sort of unfortunately buy into this idea that God is going to beautify the church through worship and the prophetic, and somehow the world are just going to come. He's never done that before, certainly in what I've read about. We need all of that, but we've got to roll our sleeves up. This is hard work. Jesus was about two things. He was about truth, but he was about engagement. Sometimes we can be very heavy on truth, but pretty poor in terms of engagement. But Jesus seemed to know what he was doing. He wasn't enforcing the status quo. He tore up the script in order to open the access route back to God for ordinary people. Okay, so as we start to come into land on this breathtaking story, people often say to me, if Jesus exists, then why doesn't he come and show us? If I've been asked that, if I another quid for every time I've been asked that question, I'll be a wealthy guy. Where is Jesus in my mess, in my chaos? It comes in different ways. Some people think, if Jesus does exist, he's probably forgotten my phone number. He doesn't rock up at my house. He doesn't live in my mess, in my challenges. But, thousands have witnessed this miracle. And surely this would be the end to the question, does Jesus exist and is he who he says he is? Can he help me? Witnessing this, absolutely amazing. So here's the aftermath, okay? Here's what the crowd said pretty much straight after this record-breaking picnic. Here we go, we're back into John 6. Why don't you give us a clue? This is afterwards, right? Why don't you give us a clue about who you are? Just a hint about what's going on. When we see what's up, we'll commit ourselves. Show us what you can do. Moses fed our ancestors. Here we go. Moses fed our ancestors with bread in the desert. It says so in the scriptures. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. They've just seen it. And they're still asking the question. Jesus responded, the real significance of that scripture is not that Moses gave you bread from heaven, but my Father is right now offering you bread from heaven. The real bread, the bread of God came down out of heaven and is giving life to the world. They jumped at that. They're still not getting it. They jumped at that. Master, give us this bread now and forever. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. The person who aligns with me hungers no more and thirsts no more. Well, if the crowd have got a few problems, what about the team? What about the boys that are around Jesus who are not seeing this for the first time? Over 5,000 people witnessing a mind-bending miracle on the equivalent of a few tuna sandwiches. Pretty impressive. Well, it's not long before Jesus has to reinforce the values of this upside-down kingdom to the very ones who are about to be leading it. None of these boys are going to win the Disciple of the Month contest. Any of them. John 6, verse 60. Many among his disciples heard this and said, this is a tough teaching, too tough to swallow. That's verse 60. Verse 66. After this, a lot of his disciples left. They no longer wanted to be associated with him. Why? Then Jesus gave the 12 their chance. Do you want to leave? There's the door, guys. It's not a lock-in. If you want out, off you go. Paraphrasing the Bible there. Peter replied. This is where Peter, with all his frailty, with all his mixed motives, and with all his emotional instability, shows his true colors. Peter replied, Master, to whom would we go? You have the words of real life, eternal life. We've already committed ourselves, confident that you are the Holy One of God. This is a defining moment for Peter. Choosing to follow Jesus means we've got to be recalibrated constantly. because we spend our lives living in this sick and dying world and we get lost, profoundly lost. Don't ever let yourself be conned into this idea that you give your life to Jesus and somehow it's just plain sailing. Some of us in this room know that that is far from the truth. But what we've got to realize is that when we allow this to recalibrate us, when we allow God to come back and challenge us and deal with us, the navigation markers get lit and we find the way through the fog. So let's use these moments, and let's use this moment to allow God to reposition us onto the coalface of mission as a church, as families, and as individuals, whatever that means for us. Let's all stand, shall we? Let me pray. Father, I want to thank you for every single person in this room, whatever their age is, whatever part of the world they've come from, whatever culture they align with, however long they've known you, and for people here who are hearing this for the very first time. People online that are tuning into this and maybe have just dropped on this, thinking they've done it by accident. Lord, I pray that your Spirit's power would work this truth into our souls today, that we would never be the same because we have been confronted with the reality of the eternal God and his timeless word into these dangerous days and these fast-moving times in which we live. I pray for this church here on the island. I pray that you would do wonderful things beyond what they could ever hope for or expect, that you would bring down the walls of this place metaphorically in order that the life that is in these people would be poured out across Newport and the island, and that we would see something that we have hoped for and dreamt for, many of us for most of our lives, a mass ingathering of men and women and boys and girls being swept into your kingdom to be carriers of this wonderful good news to the ends of the earth. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.